some slides. Good afternoon. I am Anto Budiarjo, and this is Monday Live, something that we do every week on Monday to help us get through the pandemic and also figure out what's on the other side for commercial buildings. Profiles on mondaylive.org. Just a reminder that the views expressed are personal, not of any company or organization. Please do post questions and comments on the Q&A and the chat boxes of Zoom. And if you can complete the survey at the end, will be good. This slide deck, if you want any of the links that we talk about, is on mondaylive.org as well. Our agenda today, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about news and trends, what we're seeing. The main part of the show today will be on energy, specifically how COVID is changing the sort of the demands or the expectations of energy management and efficiency. Before that, I'll just quickly go through some slides that the team has put together. Roger's talking about some new research that is actually referring to 80-year-old science. Maybe we can talk about that once we get going here. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Ken's talking about transformation, which is his focus for next month, I think, right, Ken? We'll talk about that as well. John talking about energy efficiency investment could create 660,000 jobs. It's great. Mark's talking about again landlord, the sort of the landlord dynamics that we've been talking about for a few weeks now. And I was talking about another readiness report from Cushman Wakefield. Jim Butler sort of talking about radical shift in work habits and also how remote work is not going to last. So that seems to be conflicting, but we'll see. And Therese, who may or may not be with us because she's up in Portland, Vancouver, talking about what's going on in California with Google, Apple notification technology stuff. And that's all the slides that I have. So I'm going to jump into Roger. You want to expand on what you were the link you provided?
Yeah, it's just a thing that Oxford and MIT have been doing a study about the social distancing thing and saying the 6-foot thing is actually 80-year-old science, and actually it's a little bit more than that. And I thought what was quite interesting from the sort of quadrant boxes that they put up, that all the top line is all about ventilation. So it's actually saying, poor ventilation, indoors or outdoor ventilation, and of course the poorer and that it's the more social distancing and things you have to have. But I also read somewhere else, which I thought was a great thing on LinkedIn blog, was that it says the people who manage your building have a greater impact on your health than your doctor, which I thought was quite a nice one. And the other articles are just talking about the continued thing we're seeing about the empty buildings, how long before they go back, and people talking about, rents have got to drop and pandemic passes, but 70% of CEOs, according to KPMG, are actually saying they're definitely going to be downsizing their offices. So there's obviously more to come over the next 18 months, 2 years in terms of how leases finish. We're not going to see the end of what, regardless of where we end up with this and whatever the normal back is, it's not going to go away in anytime soon.
Interesting tidbit on that 6-foot rule, Roger. That actually dates back to, that's why we bury people at 6 feet and more, because that dates back to the Black Plague, right? Because that's where they believed that 6 foot was the depth that you had to go before it could transmit itself.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow. Hey, Therese, are you okay out there on the west?
Yes, the air is like something I've never experienced, and certainly not in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, but fires.
Mm.
That's
I think
unbelievable.
Ken was telling me that even out in Vancouver Island, you're seeing the smoke there.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's very, I can only see probably an eighth of a mile in front of my house kind of thing for smoke.
Well,
Yeah. We hope the rain starts.
Right, we're the same
Turn
way.
it into acid.
Yeah.
Did you dig in much more about the 660,000 jobs in energy efficiency, John?
Yeah, just a couple of things on the news items I highlighted. You know, what that reminded me about is, you know, kind of what a lot of us on this call have been doing for our entire career, right? Energy efficiency creates financial value. It creates economic growth. And, you know, here's very separate people, you know, different than us in industry talking about this, right? Because of the need, how do we restart the economy and stuff like that. And, you know, the only, you know, I guess maybe a little bit of a joking comment I'll have about it is, you know, you present case studies throughout the years of the different manufacturers you've been with, and, you know, and people say, you know, is that case study true? And, you know, one time I said, well, actually we lie on some of them. We reduce the energy savings because people wouldn't believe it, right? This is a reality. You can save that much energy that it seems incongruous, right? So anyways, I thought that was important, but the marker one, remote work is killing the hidden office economy. I think that's a really interesting article I'd suggest people look at, because it's talking about all of the businesses surrounding the high rise that service the people for lunches, that even if some people go back to the office part-time, they're not going those places. They're not going to use the local dry cleaner. They're not going to use all those local things. It was a really different perspective on it. It's not just, can people go back up the elevator to their office? And finally, something we've been talking about for a number of weeks with buildings being shut down, you know, HVAC problems unrelated to COVID, right? Mold, rot, other things are actually holding up reopening of some facilities. So, because of lack of maintenance and lack of focus on those things.
Right. John, just to make that point and connect the fires, people are looking at climate change and energy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's time.
Well, I think that's great news in a way, but I'm not sure that actually everybody is, because not that many people live in the affected areas, which is sad in its own right, but it's becoming very real. Any other perspective anybody want to bring up before we get into the main show, as it were?
Sorry, I wouldn't mind just talking. We put this article out on transformation, and that's going to evolve to be our October theme. And I think we're all trying to transform our business models and services. But one of the problems we're having is ever what our market is, it's transforming. And so it's very difficult to sort of catch all of that. And lots of changes in the industry, lots of basically combining competencies, just a lot of change going on that is making it very complicated to understand what it is we are really doing. So we're kind of chasing an elusive model that we don't really know what it's going to be yet. And so it's interesting I think to discuss, because some of the pieces are completely disappearing.
Yeah, good point.
And one pitch connecting thought again for the article I put in there about the app that both Google and Apple are working on and that UCs are piloting, is that ability to take the data that maybe you learned from your health that you've record that you've got COVID, and automatically notify the people that you've been in contact via your phones. Those sorts of changes that don't seem to be within our industry, I think are going to be really important. And it will be another, you know, Google comes up a lot right now, especially with their new ontology push. This is some of the ways they're going to be putting together those data streams of health data streams, building data streams, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was just, you know, an interesting article to take another look at.
I think we had a really good control talk on Saturday with Brian Turner. And Brian's been working with Google on their building services. And it's actually their internal building services for their own facilities. And what they're doing is, as they develop anything, they open source it, which is kind of an interesting concept. But that kind of a change is that we're now in a situation that both Google, Amazon services, and Microsoft know what Haystack is, where a few years ago we didn't know, possibly even a few months ago, they didn't know what any of that stuff was. So we're becoming very visible. We're coming from the back into the forefront. So, but that being said, we're becoming a mashup of these larger identities. And so I think that's an interesting trend for us all to keep our heads up on as well.
But Ken, I know that Google, I've read the articles, Google says, when they look at their intelligent buildings tag model, they only know of Haystack to compare them to why theirs is better. I mean, that's the depth that they've gone into it.
I think sure. If you listen to what Brian Turner has to say, had Haystack 4 been out of the chute, they probably wouldn't have had to develop so much. Basically, they started at a time when Haystack was more or less just a naming convention. It has evolved greatly in the last little while. So that's his pitch on it. So there's actually some interesting information in the go-between back and forth there too. So that was interesting that I hadn't really seen that as a barrier. The timing of Haystack 4 would have been great if it was 2 years before, or even if it was totally completed now.
Okay, so let us move on. So we have as a guest this week, Peter Kelly Detweiler, otherwise known as PKD or Peter. Hello, Peter. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Great. It's great to have you here. Great to see you. And so the question of this week is how COVID is impacting, let's say, the demand of energy efficiency and energy management. And you work in the sort of the corporate and enterprise space, and you talk to sort of leaders there. Maybe you can start by giving us your perspective of what's going on and what people are saying about energy. As some people are sort of thinking it's no longer an issue, and other people are saying differently. So give the floor to you, and then we'll have other people sort of chime in and have a discussion about it. So over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me. A couple of things that I've observed among the many hats that I wear. One is I am the director of educational programs for Smart Energy Decisions, which is a forum of buyers and solutions providers. And it's the likes of on the solutions providers, the NRG, the Siemens, the Constellations, a lot of the solar development, wind development companies, et cetera. And on the other side of the equation, it's the GMs and the Coles and some of the REITs and many large industrials, et cetera. And one thing we're hearing is that many of the large corporations, despite what's going on with COVID, they have not changed and are not able to change their commitments to sustainability, to getting to some net zero target. And I don't know if you saw the one Google announced today. They're not just getting to net zero, they're going to match every hour of consumption with renewables or other non-carbon resources. So it's not like I fill my bucket with clean kilowatt hours. It's every single thing I consume is matched with a clean kilowatt hour, irrespective of the shape of my demand relative to my resources on the other side of the equation. So there's an increasing level of sophistication set within the uncertainty that COVID lays down in terms of, I'm hearing a lot of folks saying, we don't know right now. The last renewable energy sourcing forum we had a month and a half ago, we had a number of large buyers saying, we don't know what our future in buildings is going to look like. We do not know what stasis looks like coming out of COVID. Not everybody's going back to work. Even if you imagined a pre-COVID world, there will have been some kind of permanent shift for X% of the population. What that looks like, how significant that shift is, nobody really knows. And I think it's going to vary a lot by by, in some cases, politics and the zeitgeist of the locations you're in. But it's clear something's going on there. The other thing that COVID did that was fascinating from a system planning perspective was it fast forwarded us as grid planners and observers about 5 years into the future. And by that, I mean, there were a lot of questions about integration of renewables into the grid 5 years from now, when wind and solar, which are the cheapest resources in the world by far, even when you strip away the subsidies, when you integrate, 20 or 30% of those, which we didn't expect we would get to for another 5 or more years. But when you reduce demand and the renewable stays the same and you back off the coal, suddenly the renewables are that percentage because you've taken you've changed the relationship of the numerator and the denominator. And so we started to see what that world looked like. And a little bit of what happened in California could potentially be attributed to the fact that we had a demand shift. And then we also had some renewables didn't show up to the party, some wind didn't blow, a gas-fired generator didn't come on, and then we had those outages prior to the fire-related ones, just when everything went to hell, 2 weeks ago. And what that showed, and I'm on this thread with about 400 of the best minds in the industry and I'm sitting back because I'm not one of those. I just watch the debate. These are all regulators, PhDs on rate making, utility economics, that sort of thing. Few of them have, though, the pragmatic experience that we all have, or that Leighton and I had trying to get something done in a building. But it's really clear that in California, if they had had more responsive assets, like what you all are trying to accomplish, they could have avoided those outages. And so there's this big policy discussion brewing now in California in terms of how do we beef up the demand side of that equation to become more responsive to grid conditions and prices. And if you look at what's going on with Texas, California, a few of the more aggressive markets right now, where Texas already, 20% of the energy in that system is wind. It's about an 80,000 megawatt system right now, 20,000 megawatts of peak capacity wind. There's another 30 or 40,000 wind in the interconnection queue waiting to be built, and about double that of solar. And so within 5 or 10 years, it's not hard to imagine Texas getting 50% of its electrons from renewables, with all the volatility that implies, the price volatility, which means that folks on the other side of the meter have a huge opportunity to either get badly wounded if they're exposed to real-time prices, or create value. So if you look at a company like Enchanted Rock, they do backup generation for buildings and other facilities. They basically get their customers to pay them for the backup service, and then they sell the optionality of using those units to a trading floor. So as long as the backup services are provided, any other time prices are high and you don't need the backup services, these guys aggregate all those assets and sell into the market. And that's a market where prices on average are $30 a megawatt hour, so 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and can go to $9 a kilowatt hour, $9,000 a megawatt hour. So they can increase by 300x on any given day if the demand is there and there's a shortage on the supply side. So in that market, responsive assets are killing it, especially if they're either a smart building or some other dispatchable asset, a generator or batteries. Now there's all kinds of batteries coming into that system. And my belief is the built space, because it's moving too slowly, probably loses the opportunity to take advantage of it. You had 10 years, you missed it. Batteries are coming in so fast right now with the cost falling by 50% in the last year alone, and it's one of the reasons I left the space. I could see the rest of the ecosystem moving so much faster than the built space. I personally decided I needed to get out of Dodge and go where the money was. And right now, just to give you a sense of it, there's 24,000 megawatt hours of storage coming into the system from one company alone, right? And then NextEra says next year alone, they're going to install enough battery storage in the United States to power the state of Rhode Island for 4 hours. So my belief is that the built space had an opportunity and they probably missed it because batteries are so damn cheap and electric vehicles are coming into the space. So, okay, maybe it's not worth instrumenting the building on that anymore. The huge opportunity now is for you to understand that the electric vehicles are going to be flooding the zone. Within the next 5 years, electric vehicles will be cheaper to own than an internal combustion engine. And by 2030 to 2035, somewhere in that range, 50% of the cars sold in the world will be electric, and a fair share in the United States as well. And so then it's going to be all about vehicle to grid. Are you charging your cars? Like, for example, with the duck curve in California, we all know the sun, there's so much solar energy, prices go negative in the middle of the day. So if you could have workplace charging where your vehicles are programmed to tummy tuck the duck and absorb energy during the middle of the day, I'm going to trademark that, by the way, and then release power at night during the neck of the duck when the grid basically has to double. Within 3 hours, it has to go from about 14,000 megs to 28,000 megs of generating capability. If you can have in your build space the opportunity for vehicles to interact with the build space, that creates this whole huge revenue stream from vehicles that are only utilized 3% of the time. So if someone said to me, what's your thesis for the build space? I'd say they missed the first opportunity and there's a huge one sitting in front of them if they're smart enough to pay attention to it. But it's going to require agility and taking some risk. There's a really cool project in, we'll go to Yokohama for a second. In early August, Nissan announced that if you went to the Yokohama Pavilion, their Nissan Pavilion, in a Nissan Leaf, and they, by the way, they just sold their 500,000th last week. It was built in the UK. It's being sold to someone in Sweden. But if you go to Yokohama with your Leaf and you want to pay for parking, you don't have to pull out your credit card. Your car will pay for the parking with electricity from the vehicle. Or in Canada, there's about 100 Nissan Leafs this summer that are going into 2 facilities up there in Ontario. And they plug into these bi-directional chargers. And essentially, there's artificial intelligence that knows their routes, how long they need to get home, how much juice is in the vehicle. And essentially, when they have their peak demand days, the vehicles just have the juice sucked out to offset the building, which otherwise would have faced these high demand charges. But instead, the vehicle's essentially filling the building with all the electrons the building needs, so it's not taking it from the grid, and they're not paying these high prices. So all these ecosystems and mashups and convergences are starting to happen. And some of the, and they're all super data intensive, which plays right to you, John Petsy. So that's, you know, where it's all headed, but it's kind of thinking about where's the system going to be in 5 years from now, and then how do I get myself ready for those opportunities? So that's how I see it, very big picture, and that's what my clients pay me to do, is kind of smash one idea and build another one and say, oh, no, here's some things that show us that's not going to work, and so on and so forth.
Great. Group.
So
we're all
who
shy.
wants to fire away? What questions have you got? I mean, I just finished also my 350-page book, my manuscript that's being published by Prometheus Books. So ask me anything about the grid, and chances are I can either give you a real answer or fool you into thinking it was a viable answer.
All right, well, fool me on this one then.
Okay.
So I got one for you. So
Sure.
I became an electric car owner about 14, 15 months ago.
What
And
kind?
A great experience, an Audi.
Okay. Yeah.
A great driving experience, but
Yep.
the whole issue of range anxiety, right, is an issue, right?
Yep, it is.
If you're going to go any place where, you know, any distance, you have to plan that. I can't even imagine letting anybody take any energy out of my battery when I go someplace.
Yeah.
So I focus on that. You know, I just can't imagine. I'll pay for the parking with my credit card. No, you're not having any of my electrons.
Right.
And I bring that up. It seems like the range anxiety has been one of the big barriers to electric vehicle adoption, right?
Yep.
Need
Yep.
more charging and longer range. But now we're going to add another level. Wow. I'm not.
Okay, so here's what's going to happen. And you're like Kramer. Remember Kramer in the automobile thing where he kept driving by one exit to the next to see if he could get back to the dealership before he ran out of gas? Remember that in Seinfeld? So my vehicle has 100. I've got a Hyundai Ioniq. So I've got like 120 in the winter and 160 in the summer. And I did a 75 each way trip to go visit some solar panels in Massachusetts, and had to turn off my AC and roll down the windows and do the Kramer thing, and got home with the warning lights going. It was so cool because I made it, right? But here's the thing. So Battery Day is in another week from Tesla, right? and they've already articulated or teased that the battery they're going to roll out has a million miles on it. And your average battery today, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, is warranted for about 150,000. Contemporary Amperex Technology, which is this huge company from China that just rolled out a 44-acre research facility with 1,000 scientists with PhDs investigating new technologies. Their CEO announced, I think it was late July, they have a 1.2 million mile battery, a lithium iron phosphate battery you can get today for a 10% premium. So what you and I bought, John, we bought paperweights.
Yeah, but I don't, that's one side, how long the battery lasts before I have to replace it at some exorbitant cost. But I'm talking about range anxiety.
Yeah, no, but here's the thing.
The building can find its own power.
Right. But because those batteries are going to have so much more cycle life on them, right? So first of all, if you're in a place where, the other thing, so the chargers you're dealing with now, right? You may be charging at home, whatever. The chargers going into the system right now are 800 volt liquid fuel chargers. So there's no vehicle yet that can take them. The capacity draw, to give you a sense, what's the average size supermarket? Someone throw out a number. A Shaw's or a, Whole Foods. Anyone know what that is? Probably 300, 350 kW. That's the size of the largest chargers right now. So the ecosystem will be built out within the next 5 years or so that the range anxiety becomes less of an issue, but you and I will still be stuck with old technology. That's why I leased my vehicle rather than buying it, because I knew it would be a piece of junk within 3 years. It's just the way the ecosystem's developing. But very shortly, you will have cars with 500 miles of range and unlimited cycling capability. So you won't have to, like right now, one reason nobody's going V to G is Tesla's nickel, cobalt, aluminum chemistry only has 500 cycles. So if you cycle that thing every day, within a year and a half, you basically have burned through the first 20% of viable life in the battery. And the battery's only rated for the first 20%. After that, it's considered functionally obsolete. But once you have, and the other thing that's coming is solid state. So solid state's probably 5 or 6 years away. And it carries about twice the energy per kilogram of today's nickel, cobalt, aluminum, or nickel, cobalt, manganese battery. So the entire ecosystem gets faster charging, twice the density. So you'll have twice the range in your car for the same weight, and you'll have unlimited cycling capability. So that whole system is going to flood the zone within the next, say, 5 to 7 years. And so that's why you have startups already going, okay, we know this is coming. So we're going to figure out where we think that puck's going and skate there ahead of time.
Thanks.
Good question. I think one of the challenges, certainly here in Europe, will be is that a lot the electric cars are obviously very good for city dwellers as well, because they do shorter distances. But the challenge is that if you live in a an apartment block, or you live in the houses that don't have a garage, you have no way of charging your car. You can't throw a cable across the sidewalk to actually do it from your house. And so the limitation is from city dwellers, they don't have the ability, even if they put it on street lights and stuff, only one person can actually park next to the street light. So for me, that's the real limitation for electric cars is, those people, which is a lot of people that live in cities, can't actually get their cars charged.
Yeah, that's true. And certainly the way our batteries are configured right now. And there was just an announcement last week from 4 motorcycle, Suzuki, Yamaha, and 2 others, that they're working on a swappable cartridge capability. So then you wouldn't have to worry about that. You'd pull up to your gas station and when you buy your propane and you just you swap out your propane for your gas grill, be the same thing. A robot could essentially pull out your cartridge and slap in another one. China's doing that. NIO has already done 500,000, just one company, swaps. The problem here is we have so many different, in Europe and the US, so many different battery chemistries, it's not likely. So then the question is going to be, will we create some kind of thing, capability to solve your problem? And it might involve storage in the street. So batteries that are in the street, fully charged, that are an intermediary between you and the car. And there are companies here in the US like EVgo, among other things, because if your car in the future draws 350 kW from a charger, the grid can't handle that, so it needs an intermediary. So a lot of companies are now putting in stationary batteries between the grid and the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, in part to solve the demand issue and in part to solve the locational problems you're discussing.
I was going to mention, so I live in Silicon Valley, and EVgo is all over the place, no matter where I park, you know, in Whole Foods. I also live where there's a lot of elementary schools and middle schools, high schools. Each one of the parking lots in those places have put the solar structures across the parking lot.
Yeah.
And everybody from the neighborhood that wants to park, and there are so many open slots all the time in every elementary school to recharge your batteries. But of course, I live in a neighborhood where every other vehicle is a electrical vehicle too. But there's a lot of infrastructure I can see going in, and the number of spots that are EVgo in like the Whole Foods parking lot are increasing. So they've got that bandwidth too.
And EVgo has specifically said we're going to put batteries between charging infrastructure and grid. And they're the largest of a fleet charging operator like that.
Yeah.
So this sounds like typical innovation. It's very messy. It's going to be messy for a while. But the vision that you're sort of portraying is that this will be the norm in 5 or 10 years, or this will become sort of all over the place. Sort of the question that I'd like to turn to is what is the relationship between that vision and the buildings and the building systems that we actually deal with? You know, how should we think about that?
I mean, part of the challenge, which, you know, certainly I experienced firsthand in the demand response space was, and we actually had this conversation with a large solar developer. Leighton and I were consultants. They were actually looking at buying a demand response company. It was like 5 years ago. And so they brought us in and we said, don't be stupid. Don't waste your time. Don't go trying to change behavior and people who don't want to have their behavior change and deal with facilities managers and all that crap. Just put batteries in on top. That's a discrete asset. It's new. You put it on a roof or someplace else. You're not having to go and deal with the facilities manager who can give you the veto and all that. It's so much faster. The sales process is simpler. You don't have to take the elevator up to the C-suite and down to the basement. And sure enough, now that company has a 35% attach rate of batteries through their new sales. Now, that isn't to say that the build space isn't critical, because it is. Because if we don't solve the build space, the carbon issue is really, really hard to resolve. And so but what I think is going to happen ultimately is it will get left behind, and society will just say, we're stuck with that. It's too difficult from a behavioral perspective. This is just my view. And we'll essentially go around it with batteries and green power, and we'll essentially, we'll recognize the building is what it is, and we'll just green up the grid around it and try and stick some batteries on where we can and just leave it behind and move forward because it's too hard.
That's not happy news.
No, but personally, I think the build space sucks. I was very frustrated dealing in that space. We didn't have any success with our with the partners we were trying to enlist. It wasn't in their DNA. It wasn't in my trading floor's DNA either. I mean, I couldn't get them to integrate what they were doing with DR. And so where you're finding the successes right now are new industries that don't have to deal with the challenge of existing ecostructure. They're just moving forward like solar, slap it on a roof or put it in a field. Batteries, it's all greenfield. It's not having to figure out how to paint white stripes on a black horse and call it a zebra. You're just, you know, creating something new. And so, no, I don't think it is good news.
I think there's been many energy crises, certainly, that we've been through that doesn't seem to make any difference to the owners who kind of always paid lip service to energy management. You know, they just didn't always get it and still don't, perhaps. But I think now with the profile of sustainability and perhaps with Generation Z coming along, it's getting more momentum and people need to be seen to be green, if you like, even if they don't need, you know, even if they're still paying lip service to it. And I'm hoping that really as that comes on, that may act as an accelerator for at least buildings to start, you know, caring about the energy they're using and the way they use it and get it.
Yeah, I do think there's a huge bifurcation between new construction, which is actually difficult, but still a lot easier. I did this, I interviewed the folks at the IBEW and National Electrical Contractors Training. They built a new facility in California like 5 years ago, and they wanted the whole thing to be net zero from the get-go, and they wanted to use it to train electricians. And so they had the architect, and they had the builder and a whole bunch of people at the table. And they said they also had nature at the table. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, we knew that we would have shadows and breezes at certain times of the year. And so we built knowing that we had to accommodate and incorporate all those things and optimize construction around what was in that natural space. And at the end, I said, what was your biggest surprise? And they said, our biggest surprise was that we weren't surprised, that we had thought this thing through and actually in the design process really tried to iterate when we were building this whole thing. And I did another, I interviewed these guys for the Parkland Hospital down in Texas, one of the largest hospital facilities. And what they did there was really cool. Again, a very high efficiency building. The entire building is modular. So that if, for example, God forbid you had a plague or something would never happen, right? They could shift. So for example, we will probably see a massive spike in maternity in about 9 months, less now, right? For obvious reasons. And so they actually can take a room and it's a modular room and they can turn it from an ICU ward to a maternity ward with relatively little work. And what they did ahead of time was they interviewed doctors, nurses, patients, families, janitors, everybody. What do you like about this space? What works for you? What doesn't? With the maxim being the patient needs to have the most control they possibly can over the room they're in. So the lighting systems all were designed for super ease of patients. But the one thing they did that matters to you all is they built chases into the entire building, assuming that they were going to have huge amounts of data in the future and other needs. And so they basically constructed the building without knowing exactly what they were going to need, but by trying to future-proof it, by making it A, modular, and then B, building in space for additional growth of piping of information and that sort of thing. And it's that kind of really creative out-of-the-box thinking that I think will win the day in a lot of these. But it'll start in the new spaces in green, build, net zero, and then some companies like Heinz and other ones are trying to go net zero in retrofits, and you'll see the leaders, and then hopefully it will trickle across. But with the triple net leasing and those kinds of artificial financial structures that make it so obtuse in terms of lining up the incentives to do the right thing, that gets really hard. Owner occupied is a lot easier than triple net lease.
Hey, Peter, just on that impact of the, as you said, in the build space, can you talk to, what do you see as far as the IoT guys getting into the energy monitoring management side as opposed to the big guys?
Yeah, I haven't seen a huge amount of, I've seen certainly lip service, and some companies have been talking about that for a long, long time. Smart cities, smart buildings, and that sort of thing. But when you look out there in terms of, okay, show me some use cases of a retrofitted type of a situation that was cost effective, not a costly pilot to prove what we can do, but something that makes economic sense. I don't see the literature being replete with lots of examples.
Peter, question on the, wind and solar have been problematic, I guess, in two respects. You can't count on them, and because they're dependent on nature at the time, and then cost effectively, they've been subsidized, right, through taxes and various incentives.
Yeah.
Now, with the battery technology starting to emerge to where we can capture that energy before it's needed, and then create essentially a consistent availability, then do the economics for the renewables suddenly become much more attractive in real terms? Because natural gas still seems to be the price leader and the most cost-effective way to go, and is very available. At what point does wind and solar, with the availability of batteries for storage, start to really truly be competitive against natural gas? Do you see that coming?
Yeah, I do. First of all, there's a bit of a thumb on the scale when you talk about renewables having subsidies and not talking about the huge amount of subsidies for hydrocarbons. But let's
Okay.
just assume we'll ignore the subsidies for hydrocarbons. So you've got
Okay.
your $24 per megawatt hour for your wind production tax credit, which goes away in a few years, and your 30% federal tax credit for solar and or batteries if the batteries are charged with solar. And that's 30%, then 26% this year, then goes to 22%, and then down to 10% in perpetuity.
Okay.
And if the battery, say, only charges, if the solar is only charged 75%, then in, say, 4 years from now, when it's 10% for that solar, then it'd be 7.5%. It would be 75% times the 10%. So you follow me, right?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay, so NextEra, which is the largest publicly traded developer, and in fact, it's the largest developer of renewables on the planet right now. They had in their investors presentation in June, they had a slide deck which I used to destroy the hopes and dreams of the folks in the modular nuclear industry in a keynote that I gave. Because the modular nuke guys were saying we can deliver at 6 cents a kilowatt or $60 a megawatt hour. And I said, yeah, that's too bad, because by 2024, without subsidies, wind with 4 hours of storage will be in the $20 to $30 range, and solar with 4 hours of storage will be in the $30 to $40 range. And NextEra is already building a facility in Oklahoma called Skeleton Creek, where they have 250 megs of wind, 250 megs of solar, 200 megawatts of batteries with 4 hours of duration, and it is almost a fully dispatchable power plant when all those pieces complement each other. Or if you take the report that just came out of the Public Utilities Commission and the 3 utilities in California last month that said, what if we looked at wind and solar in their ability to meet peak load? What would that look like today? And so if you put solar panels on fixed axis panels that just tilt them in one direction, they roughly met peak demand 6% of the time. And if you added 4 hours of storage, they were up over 99%, because
Wow.
you're shifting that output. So if you look at a place like Kauai, they already have a couple of large solar arrays, like 13 megs of solar, 13 megs of storage, 4 hours of duration, a couple of those big ones, a little bit of biomass, and then some diesel. Last year, they were at 57% renewables in a balancing authority, like they can't export or import power from anywhere, year round. And this year, at least 5 hours every day, they're 100% renewables. So they kind of show you what can be done. So where you probably get to is Grid 1.0 is integrating about 30% energy from wind and solar into the grid, and then cycling the hell out of your gas-fired plants in ways they weren't designed to do, but they are doing. And they go down to turn down mode about 20 or 30% of max. They don't like to shut off, because if cold steel starting up, there's a lot of stress on the machine, so you have limited amount of cycles. So they put them in turn down mode, try and limit emissions, and then ramp back up again. And so in California in the afternoon, they're ramping up, like fleets of them are ramping up really, really fast to follow the load. And combustion turbines, aeroderivatives, the ones that's just a jet engine from a plane bolted on a platform, can do that much faster than a natural gas combined cycle, where there's a steam generator on the back end taking the waste heat from the unit. So today, if you cycle the heck out of all your conventional assets, you can integrate 30% without adding any batteries. Then if you add 4 hours of storage in, you can probably get up to about 70%, maybe 75% integration into the grid and run it reliably. But then you do have those days where you have an atmospheric river, say over California, where it rains and rains and rains for days, or a front comes across Texas. Yeah, now what do you do then? So the thinking is, I mean, there are a few companies like Form Energy that just announced a partnership with Great River Wind in Minnesota, where it's 1 megawatt of capacity, 250 megawatt hours, or 150, sorry. And then hydrogen is the next great hope. And so there was a study that Morgan Stanley did in August saying that within 2 years, they think wind in Texas will be cheap enough to start turning into a hydrogen through the process of electrolysis and then storing the hydrogen. In fact, there's a plant called the Intermountain plant that Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has, where it's an 840 megawatt plant. It's coming online in 2024, and 30% of the fuel mix is going to be hydrogen right from the get-go. And it's meant to be green hydrogen. And then last week, Mitsubishi just sold 3 hydrogen-capable turbines for 3 projects in the United States. And then a couple weeks ago, Florida Power and Light announced that they're going to the Public Utilities Commission to try and get permission to spend $65 million for their first hydrogen project, because you guys all know about inverters, right? They're expensive. And you know about your solar curve. So your solar curve goes up and then goes down. You don't put the inverter to size for the maximum peak day, because that'd be a waste. You do it to size for about your 2/3 of your peaks, and then the rest of it you just waste. It's called solar clipping. And they've said there's enough clipped solar that we think, with adding in other pieces, it's cost effective for us to put hydrogen in the mix. So now if you look in places like Europe, there were 11 gas transport companies that announced in July, maybe August, that they're going to build out 25,000 megawatts, 25,000 kilometers of pipeline, reformulating existing gas pipeline to make it hydrogen capable. And Shell has announced a 10 gigawatt, so 10,000 megawatt offshore wind project dedicated to production of hydrogen. Ørsted's looking at 5,000 megawatts. Siemens has a big project going in the Middle East. They said that green hydrogen is going to be the new oil in 10 years. So what probably happens in the next 20 years, if we live long enough to see it, is that the electron begins to dominate the entire landscape, not in the form of electricity, but moving into industry and transport, et cetera, in the form of hydrogen.
So my follow-up question has to do with distributed power. So
Yeah.
I agree with you. If green's going to ultimately win the day between solar, wind, and hydrogen, then the build space is going to say, well, I'll just buy from the utility, because that's the easiest answer for them to look good, right?
Yeah.
I'm just buying utility. I'm associating myself with a utility who emphasizes green, right?
Yeah.
But from a distributed point of view, these larger buildings can have their own local solar, their local wind. Over time, the building shell can be a solar collector, right? And now with batteries, they can then store that energy locally and basically create the building turns into a cogen operation effectively, where they can be off the grid for a substantial amount of time. Do you see that being in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you're starting to see building integrated photovoltaics, BIPV. But I mean, and again, that's easier in a new situation than a retrofit, because unless you can find it, there are some window coatings they're looking at that are possible. So you could turn your building into a solar plant, and then, obviously add batteries to the mix, right? There are already a ton of buildings in California that have batteries in the basement or on site to mitigate demand charges. And there are companies like STEM and others that supersize them. They do the, say, 250 kW to manage the building's demand charge. And while we're at it, we'll double the pad, we'll put in a little bit more electronics, and we'll dispatch another 250 kW to sell services to the grid or to the distribution utility. So the idea of the build space becoming a really active participant in Hawaii, they say by 2045, they expect 50% of the electrons produced and consumed to come from the customer side of the meter. It won't be wind, because wind is a function of a cube of the wind speed. And so you really need to go high, and then it's a square of the swept space. So that's all about gigantism versus solar, which is modular, right? Okay. And so you'll probably see much more solar on location in car parks and that sort of thing, and canopies and rooftops and that sort of thing, to help to mitigate that problem. And then batteries, playing a huge role, because again, the costs are coming down so fast. Every time you double the global output, you cut the cost by roughly 20 to 25%.
Peter, I have a question on the battery and the grid. You had mentioned 2 years ago, actually, at the Energy Thought Summit, that you hated the build space.
I've hated build space forever. You guys are too slow. We don't
my question is, again, on the sustainability side. The electrical cars deplete, but when they deplete, they are not bad. They are not to be thrown out. They can be actually used on the grid side.
Right.
Do you see regional conversion centers that would go directly to the buildings instead of being overhauled long distances?
Do I see a regional convergence?
Conversion from depleted car batteries into buildings.
Yeah. So you're seeing, for example, there's a company called Mobility House in Europe, and there's the Johan Cruyff Stadium in Amsterdam, which is Ajax, the football, the soccer team. And there are about, I think it's 250 Nissan Leaf carcasses, like 40% of it's new and 60% is used batteries. It's about 3 megawatts, and they sell services to the grid. And then whenever there's an event, they use the batteries for backup power. And now that company, Mobility House, is in negotiations with 6 other arenas. The real question is going to be, when you get 1.2 million mile batteries, do you pull the battery out of car number 1 and drop it into car number 2? But right now, a battery is considered functionally obsoleted when it has 80% of its range left. And so there's a thinking from companies like Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others that within about 5 years, we're going to see this enormous tsunami of used batteries coming in at pennies on the dollar into the space. Now, the challenge of that is some of them are prismatic, some of them are pouches, some of them are in cylindrical cells. They're all different manufacturers. And so, yeah, Underwriters Labs already has their code 1974, which the insurance companies are behind. But as the CTO of NEC said to me, if you add a storage system with all these different chemistries, some of which have been worked really hard in some cars and some others are not, you'd have to have operators in roller skates racing around chasing blinking red lights all day. But then there are other people who say, nope, the resource is going to be so cheap that it's going to be worth figuring that out. Now, the speed with which you'll have to do that, just to give you a sense, the Gigafactory that Musk has spits out battery cells faster than a machine gun can shoot bullets. In fact, apparently the human eye can't follow the machine, it's so fast. So just as you're producing that much, you have to create capabilities on the other side involving a lot of artificial intelligence to quickly determine which cells are good and then which ones you throw into the recycling stack. And JT Straubel, or JB Straubel, the former Tesla CTO, he's now built this company called Redwood. And they say, forget Second Life. There's enough value in the cobalt and lithium. We want this to be like the mine mouth, essentially. We'll put the recycling facility right at the front end of the factory manufacturing the batteries, and we'll source our lithium and our other materials from those recycled batteries. The only challenge there is, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you, the chemistries are moving so fast that the dominant chemistry in nickel, manganese, cobalt a year ago or 2 years ago was 1 to 1 to 1. Nickel, manganese 1, cobalt 1. And now already that's shifted to 8 to 1 to 1. And some companies are already saying we're going to go 9 nickel, 0.5% manganese, 0.5% cobalt. And so it's all moving very, very, very quickly. And so if you're building an ecosystem to recycle batteries with cobalt being the most valuable thing in there, and suddenly cobalt's not there anymore, there's some risk around building that recycling ecosystem. So there's a lot of moving parts. And then, you know, the CEO of Panasonic articulated, well, what if we build all this stuff and then we shift to solid state within 5 years? What then, right? And that's likely to be the outcome. And what we'll probably end up seeing 5 to 10 years down the road is, right now, vehicles and stationary storage are a mashup between lithium ion, lithium iron phosphate, nickel manganese cobalt, nickel cobalt aluminum. And what we'll probably see is a bifurcation where solid state takes over the electric vehicle industry, and then lithium iron phosphate ends up being the predominant chemistry in the stationary storage because it's more stable, it's a little bit cheaper, and it's got, you know, decent cycle life as contemporary Amperex and others have shown. That's not quite yet clear. Those are the signals I look for to sort of untangle where this is all headed. What I typically do is I build a thesis in my head about X or Y or Z, and then I look for data points telling me that I was stupid, or data points that start to reaffirm that, yeah, I'm on the right track on this one. And that's a constantly evolving. I mean, I read something every third week that makes me feel like an idiot, but then there are those other things that tell me I'm a genius. So I'm somewhere in the middle.
Peter, could we ask you about heating of buildings? Because up here in the northern climates, we still do have to heat occasionally. Yep. And some people are proponents of full electrification, and others are thinking about, well, green methane or green hydrogen to fuel our boilers. I'm specifically interested in commercial buildings. What's the future of heating in commercial buildings?
Yeah, I think probably you're going to see the ground source, you know, that the heat pump technology dominate for a while. Ultimately, because already you see some pretty efficient technologies out there, ultimately one could see more hydrogen in the mix. I think you'll start to see that more in a place like Europe with its district heating, where they will replace methane with hydrogen at some point. And then the question is, do we see a migration, over to the United States as the technology gets cheaper and more well known? But my belief is we certainly are seeing this push towards beneficial electrification, right? Where we're trying to push out fossil fuels and particularly methane and heating. So I think we'll have a reliance on the electron directly for a while, and then potentially maybe hydrogen moves into the mix further down the road.
Any other?
Anybody else stump the chump?
Yeah, I've
You've
seen,
learned a lot of
okay,
this.
on the electric side, I have the Prius, so I kind of hedge my bets and have my own online generation. But I
Yeah.
saw the next generation of that is basically you take out the internal combustion engine and you put in a hydrogen. Would we see basically hybrid systems that would be used for heating and our buildings?
Oh, like a cogen type thing with hydrogen?
Yes.
Yes, you may well. Yeah. There have been some interesting challenges they've had to solve with that. Among other things, like the flame speed of hydrogen is a lot faster than it is for methane. That is, the flame moves across the gas a lot faster. And so I had great luck with my book in terms of the people I was able to talk to. I went out to Schenectady and sat down with 10 of GE's top their main hydrogen guy and a lot of their main turbine guys for 7 hours one day just before COVID hit. And they explained to me they had to completely change the configuration of the injection nozzles in order to make those turbines work. But then they proved they could do it. And so it's already technically feasible to create those kinds of cogeneration systems using hydrogen for the electricity and then the waste heat. The real challenge is going to be how cheap can we get the renewables, because that's the input fuel, and then how quickly can we drop the cost of the electrolyzers, which are essentially a reverse fuel cell. And it's beginning to look like China might dominate that space the way they've done with solar modules and with batteries, because at the end of the day, it's all about building a manufacturing ecosystem and then driving all the inefficiencies out of the supply chain. And they're already seem to be getting a jump on that. Yeah, there are some other players, Fuel Cell Energy and others in the United States using different technologies to try and get there. But right now there's a huge race to get the cost of those electrolyzers down to the point where your world then becomes more feasible, because hydrogen has to get a lot cheaper than it is today.
So we're getting to the end of the show. What do you suggest we do here as this group that's focused obviously on the smarts, on the data side of things? Give us some of your wisdom.
I mean, I think data is really critical, it still is. And one of the things that I think has always intrigued me is, are there ways you could take what's in the battery and the data there, and then the data in a building, and do kind of a hybrid demand response with what the batteries, or what I mean is a price responsive or situationally responsive building, where you're not just looking at one technology, but essentially you're bridging across multiples, right? Because at the end of the day, they're both big data plays. Batteries are a huge data play. It's all about location, it's about time, and it's about how fully charged or not, and then market conditions. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, a building's a thermal battery in many ways, right? So I think there are some ways to investigate that mashup and try and figure out, okay, since we know batteries are going to be an inevitable part of the ecosystem, are there ways we can augment or complement what is happening in that and create something that's bigger than the sum of the parts? And then the other piece of it is, with EVs coming in, folks who know that they have certain profiles of customers in certain markets like California, other places where they're trying to integrate a lot of renewables, workplace charging, and that evolving system around the electric vehicle could become a critical element of how you manage a building. And certainly anybody with fleets. But if you've got a lot of, let's say you have a bunch of folks with Tesla 100Ds, that car has 100 kilowatt hours of storage in it, which is roughly 3 1/3 times the average residential household in the United States of days worth of consumption. That's a lot of juice. So if you had something where you could do like those folks in Ontario and create, see if the economic value proposition there. It probably is in California because of the time of use rates and some other things. Understanding those markets and what the financial backdrop is, tariffs, et cetera, and trying to figure out, okay, what's likely to emerge in the near future? Where can I, as data experts and building experts, incorporate these other trends into what I'm trying to do now? And certain things that may not be cost effective today, standing on their own, potentially do become cost effective when you blend them in, just like, you know, with efficiency. Lighting, super cost effective. Sometimes you use that and you make other investments as well, riding on the back of your great, you know, return on lighting. So same sort of thing. Think about how you're blending what you're doing with these other approaches, understanding all of it's super data intensive. And if you're good at that, it's a great opportunity.
Well, PKD, thank you very much. You've given us an enormous amount to think about, and really appreciate you being here. And that brings us to the end of the show. The YouTube of this will be up by morning time, and we'll meet again next week on Monday. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to the attendees, and thanks for PKD again.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Hey, guys.
Bye-bye.